Bend Around the Wind by Skylia. Chapter 73. Weight of Trust. Thor's arrival was unexpected. Jarvis simply just announced it when he landed on the roof and headed down with the elevator. Steve and Bucky looked at one another, then got up to greet him. Thor looked forlorn. That was the best word for it. His eyebrows curled down in a firm frown, his lips were tight, and he gripped his hammer too tightly. He was injured as well. Steve could see faint gashes on his cheek, mostly healed, but still visible. When he looked up at Steve and Bucky, his stern expression vanished, and he smiled as he walked closer.
"My friends," he greeted, "it is very good to see you again."
Steve held out a hand, and Thor clasped his forearm in a tight grip, then pulled him a little closer for a quick hug and a few heavy pats on the shoulder. Bucky grinned as he held his arm out, and Thor did not hesitate to clasp his forearm as well. They didn't hug, but they never did, so it was all right. "We didn't know you were back," Steve said.
"I have gone to Tony Stark's house,"
Thor answered, and his face spoke volumes. "Things didn't go well with Loki?" Steve asked, pointing at the gashes on Thor's face.
"This was not my brother,"
Thor said,
"and I'm to blame for them as well."
"Tell me you didn't get in a fight with Tony," Steve asked.
"Nay."
Thor shook his head right away.
"Tony has grown into a wise man in his absence. He merely had some choice words for me."
Going by Thor's expression, it couldn't have been the most pleasant of conversations. "So what brings you here, then?" Steve asked. "Not that I'm not glad to have you back, but I didn't think you would take the time to come here." "Wait, did you fly here from Malibu?" Bucky interrupted. Thor nodded.
"I needed to clear my head,"
he said.
"It was a good way as any to do it."
Bucky whistled. "Quite the flight," Steve agreed. "So what brings you here, then?"
"I would like to talk to you about certain things. Loki, mainly,"
Thor said.
"You have given me good advice in the past, and I thought it could not hurt to ask your opinion on the matter."
"Well, gosh, yeah, sure. I mean, if I can help, I will," Steve said. There was something very humbling about being asked for advice by Thor. It was just such a great show of trust and respect, especially if it was about Loki, because that was always a difficult subject with Thor. "Speaking of, you should see someone first," Steve said and pointed at the elevator. Bucky joined them, of course. "So how did meeting little brother again go then?" Bucky asked.
"It was confusing for the most part,"
Thor replied after a moment.
"A lot better than our last meeting was. We still got into a fight, though."
Ouch. "Sorry to hear," Steve said. Just because he wanted nothing to do with Loki, it didn't mean he couldn't understand how Thor felt.
"I expected worse."
Thor shrugged a little. The elevator chimed, and Steve stepped out first. Thor looked around.
"Clint is here?"
he asked, noticing which floor they were on. "He's no longer S.H.I.E.L.D., Bucky announced cheerfully. Thor turned to look at him in surprise, then nodded approvingly.
"That is very good news,"
Thor said.
"Has the Lady Natasha joined us as well?"
"Nah, she's still on the other side of the line," Bucky said, shrugging a little. "Not sure if she'll come around."
"Strange for her and Clint to be separated,"
Thor remarked. "You'll see why it happened, though," Steve said as they reached Clint's gym. "Hey, guys!" Clint greeted, then turned to look at them. "Thor, hey! Welcome back!" Thor smiled, then he noticed the other person in the room, and his smile kind of froze in place in surprise.
"Coulson,"
he said. Clint and Phil walked closer. It was one of those very rare times that Steve saw Phil in something other than a suit. Phil needed some workout to get back in form after years of inactivity, so he started quite a stern training routine right on the very first day he got back on his feet. Phil in training clothes was always a surreal sight for some reason. "Thor?" Phil nodded. Thor stared at him in shock for another moment, then stepped forward and engulfed him in a bear hug, squeezing him for a moment. If it would have been anyone else, they might have been startled by the sudden movement, but this was Phil Coulson, so he just went with it. "Yes, hello, Thor," he greeted again and patted his upper arm a little.
"I thought..."
He stepped back and looked the man over.
"What has happened? You are alive."
"I was critically injured," Phil told him with his usual straightforwardness.
"Why have I not been told?"
Thor asked, turning around to look at Steve.
"I thought my brother has killed him."
Thor, we didn't know either, Steve placated him. Clint found out accidentally and got him out.
Out from where?
Thor asked, his face darkened a moment later before anyone could say anything.
Was this shield some scheme from Fury again?
I have been put into protective custody, Phil said. More like swept under the rug, Clint commented.
We have been lied to then,
Thor said with a displeased frown. You can't honestly be surprised by that after all this time. Becky said.
I wish I could be, Thor said, but my lack of surprise does not make such lies any less infuriating.
If that ain't the truth, Becky agreed.
So is this why you finally left S.H.I.E.L.D. then?
Thor turned to Clint. Well, that was more like them not wanting me anymore, Clint said. He made a deal with Loki to get Phil out, Steve explained before Thor could ask.
My visit here is not any less confusing than my visit to Stark's house was,
Thor said after a moment. Clint scoffed. Made a deal with Loki. You say it like I had to sell my soul or something, he said.
What did you give then?
Thor asked. There was definitely a hint of concern in his tone. I sort of just told him he owes me a few favors for the whole mind thing, and he agreed. Thor's frown deepened. I know, trust me, I was really surprised it worked. It was a split-second decision, kind of a gamble, really. What he means is that he marched into Tony's house and demanded Loki's help, Steve summarized. He was still convinced that it was one of the most reckless and idiotic things Clint had ever done. It could have ended so very badly.
My brother is not known to react well to demands,
Thor said. Yeah, he said there was only so much attitude he was willing to let slide, Clint said.
Yes, that sounds more like him.
Thor nodded. But he still did what I wanted, so whatever, it worked. Clint shrugged.
You have taken a great risk by confronting my brother like that,
Thor said.
But I have known you to be both brave and foolish.
Clint just chuckled at that. I suggest you take a seat outside, Phil said then. Clint can explain everything to Thor in detail once we join you. Then Thor can speak about what brought him here. Unsurprisingly, they did what he said without arguing. Before anything, Thor excused himself and went to his own floor to put down his hammer, his cape, and some of his armor, and pick up his Stark phone. He never really used it because he didn't know many people outside of the other Avengers, but it was a gift from Pepper, so he actually kept it on his person whenever he didn't forget about it. He also managed to fry one or two when he accidentally had it on him while he called lightning. A brand new one always arrived the next day whenever that happened. After they all settled down, Clint summarized what happened with Loki fairly quickly. He said the exact same things he told Steve and Bucky the first time around. Steve still didn't know whether he left out any details or not, but he did not question him. Clint was no longer in S.H.I.E.L.D. Steve no longer had to worry about missing details. Not that Clint was ever dishonest with them. He didn't even lie by omission as far as Steve could tell. It was always Natasha Steve had to keep an eye on, but apparently not even she was involved in the whole Phil thing. At least, that's what Clint told them, she said. Clint believed her, so Steve was leaning toward believing her as well. Thor looked thoughtful while Clint talked, probably trying to see Loki's reasons for giving in to Clint's demands. Steve still had a hard time believing that he did it from the goodness of his heart. Clint was convinced that Loki just played nice for Tony's benefit, but it was still hard for Steve to wrap his head around it.
This elixir you speak of,
Thor asked once Clint fell silent.
A liquid with a golden glow.
That's the one, Clint nodded. It's kosher, right?
It is indeed a healing potion. I drank from it myself several times over the centuries when I was gravely injured. Still, I believe I do not need to tell you how reckless it was of you to simply take a magical concoction from my brother.
Well, Tony was obviously fine from it, and it's not like Phil could have gotten any worse. I agree that the risk factor was high, Phil said, but it is true that there was not much to lose and a lot to gain. Clint made the right call and it paid off. I'm known for making right calls, Clint said.
I did not realize my brother used it on Tony as well.
He looks younger now than when he left, Clint pointed out.
I didn't notice,
Thor shrugged. It must be different for an immortal eye, Bucky guessed. So now you're up to date on what happened since Tony and Loki showed up, Steve said. Your turn. How are you still here? I thought you would take Loki back to Asgard right away.
I intended to do so, or at least attempt it, but my brother wished to speak with me, and I couldn't say no.
They kind of expected this from the moment Loki made him promise that they would leave decisions concerning him in Thor's hands. They were sure that Loki wouldn't just let himself be taken. He was definitely getting extra time already. And? Clint prompted.
And it is a complicated situation. My brother has expressed his aversion to be judged in Asgard.
Wow, so he doesn't want to go to trial. How surprising, Clint said.
You misunderstand,
Thor said.
My brother does not deny his crimes, not all of his crimes, but he wishes to face the Jotnar and pay his due to them instead of being judged in Asgard.
Why? Steve frowned. I thought they were your enemies. Why would you rather go there?
Loki is a Jotun himself,
Thor said after a moment of hesitation.
He claims, I must admit rightly so, that he has committed crimes against them and not against Asgard. Loki believes Asgard has no right to put him on trial.
What exactly were these crimes again? Bucky asked him.
He has killed their king, Laufey. He was Loki's father, his real father. He also tried to use the Bifrost to destroy the whole realm with every single frost giant on it.
And he would rather face them than you guys? Clint asked. Why the heck would he do that?
I know not,
Thor said.
I have stopped him before he could destroy the realm, but I do not know the extent of the damage he has wrought, so I know not how severely they would try to punish him. But Loki said that Asgard would not judge him fairly, while on Jotunheim he would be sure that he's only judged for what he has done.
Is he right? Steve asked. I don't know much about the Asgardian justice system.
In Asgard he will be judged by the king, my father,
Thor said.
All his crimes would be listed in front of the people of Asgard. Then the king would listen to all who wished to speak up against Loki or in his defense. Then he would decide on a suitable punishment for his crimes.
How severely would your father punish him? Phil asked.
I do not know, Thor said. I do believe he still loves Loki as a son, but my father can be very harsh in his judgment. He has been silent on the matter.
I believe it is fair to say that Loki has at least some idea about what his punishment in Asgard would be like, Phil said.
I doubt my father would banish him, for even stripped of his immortality, my brother would be a powerful mage,
Thor said.
He would not be helpless or any less dangerous. Loki is also in a self-imposed exile, so it would make no sense to banish someone who already left of their own will. So I believe it would be some form of imprisonment.
And what would he get if he went to the Frost Giants? Steve asked.
I do not know,
Thor admitted.
I know nothing of Jotun law or tradition.
Does Loki? Clint asked.
I doubt he had studied it in great length,
Thor said.
We, neither of us was ever overly fond of their kind. Before we knew Loki was one of them.
We must assume he has some knowledge about it, Phil said. Or some leverage, Bucky said. You say the king was his real dad, so even if he killed him, does that make him the new king or something? Thor thought about it for a second.
Such thing would not be possible in Asgard, but I do not know about Jotunheim. Maybe it is not unheard of among them.
Whether it's true or not, he must have a plan, right? Steve asked. That's why he wants to go there instead of Asgard.
I believe so,
Thor agreed. Oh, what about Earth, huh? Clint asked. Who's going to judge him for that?
My brother said he would pay his due to Midgard when the time came, and that until then he would stand by Tony Stark's side.
Pay his due? Steve repeated. That's not how it works. He can't just decide that he's going to give us something to fix things, like some sort of a wereguild, Bucky said. Everyone turned to look at him. What? I read.
An oath like that is not to be belittled,
Thor continued.
It is more than just simple wereguild, for he intends to repay you by service. That is an offer even my father would have to accept as fair.
Seriously? He promises to be nice to us and all is forgotten? Clint asked incredulously.
He intends to defend you.
We can defend ourselves, Steve said.
I know you can, my friend,
Thor said, but his phone chimed. Thor frowned at it for a second where it sat on the coffee table. Text, Clint pointed out helpfully.
Right.
Thor grabbed it, still looking more than a little perplexed. He didn't fumble with it or anything. He said it was a simple enough device to operate right on the first day he got one.
Not from a number the phone knows,
he said. Wait, let me guess, Clint said as he stretched to the side to fish his own phone out of his pocket. He looked up something on it, then leaned over to glance at Thor's screen. He huffed and shook his head, pocketing his phone again. Knew it! Loki!
My brother has one of these,
Thor asked. He's with Stark. His smartphone is probably 100 times better than ours, Clint said. Why do you have Loki's number? Steve asked. In case I need a favor, Clint said. FYI, he totally switched off his GPS, or Stark did it for him, whatever. It can't be traced. Thor was frowning down at his phone, maybe because he disliked texts as much as Steve did, maybe because of whatever the text said. After a moment, Thor dropped his phone back on the coffee table and scowled at him. Thor?
It's nothing,
Thor said. Back to our previous discussion, Phil continued. Thor, do you think Loki's promise is a fair enough compensation for the things he did? Steve felt like it was a loaded question, and Thor looked at Phil for a long moment before he answered.
The threat of Thanos is not something to be taken lightly,
Thor said. Thanos? Steve asked.
The Mad Titan. I assumed Tony and Loki have informed you all about him,
Thor said. They never gave us a name, Steve said. But yeah. Thor continued.
Even by Asgardian law, in the time of need, those who have committed wrongs are allowed to fight to reclaim their honor or freedom if they were imprisoned.
I'm not asking about Asgardian law, but your opinion, Phil said.
I cannot judge this matter just by following my heart,
Thor said.
For if I listen to my heart, I will decide as a brother, and I'm not certain all would be happy with that.
Why? Would you let Loki off the hook? No questions asked, Clint asked.
No,
His phone chimed again, and Thor groaned this time when he reached for it. His scowl smoothed out a little when he looked at it, but he did not look any happier. He sighed.
Please excuse me,
he said, and stood up, heading towards the elevator, probably to get to his own floor. Once the doors closed and Thor was out of sight and earshot, Steve turned to look at the others. I'm probably not the only one, but I'm getting really sure that Thor's going to go along with what Loki wants. To be fair, it sounded like he's been given good reasons. Bucky shrugged. It's Loki, Clint said. Once you allow him to speak, he's probably going to convince you about one thing or another. And he's got Stark playing in his court. They're smart. They're really terrifyingly smart. They know how to play their cards right. Well, he definitely wants to get out of being judged by Asgard, Steve said. He must have good reasons for it. I think it's sort of like you get caught doing something bad in a third world country, then you're going to fight tooth and nail to get a trial in your homeland instead, Bucky said. You got better chances there. He must have a way to placate the frost giants, Phil said. If Asgard agrees to let him be judged there and he comes to an agreement with them, then he is free. Or he knows he would be locked up in Asgard and he would just rather take his chances in the other realm, Bucky said. I don't think Loki would leave things up to luck. He must have a plan, Steve said. And what exactly can we do about it? Clint asked. You already agreed that Thor is the decision maker. We won't do anything, Bucky said easily. Steve turned to look at him. What? Why would we do anything? Because he shouldn't be allowed to get away with this, Steve said. You catch a bad guy, send that bad guy back to his country, then you leave it up to them how to handle him, Bucky said. Even if he can get out of it without being punished? Steve asked. Stark said he was punished enough, Bucky said. And he's not some maniac hell-bent on conquering Earth anymore. I say this is already done and over with. We should just move on. We keep an eye on him. If he steps out of line, we intervene. Otherwise, we should just leave him alone. You mean that? Steve said. He was surprised a little because Bucky was not one to let things slide easily. Of course I mean that, Bucky said. But he's Loki, Clint said. We can't just let him do whatever he wants. Why not? Don't forget the things he did, Steve reminded him. Bucky was not with them back at the time of the invasion, so he did not experience it firsthand, but he knew enough about it. Oh, dear God, you are serious, Bucky groaned. You really don't see the problem with that. Steve frowned a little. Clint shrugged. Phil remained silent. Okay, so if Loki's not allowed to live his life without being properly punished, then I guess I should just swing my way over to the nearest prison. I better take Natasha with me while I'm at it. What are you talking about? Steve asked. I'm talking about double standards, Steve, Bucky said. Clint makes a different call and decides Natasha should live despite all the things she's done. She's your shield. All is well. You make a different call and decide that I shouldn't be killed no matter what I've done. I join the Avengers, all is well. Stark makes a different call, decides Loki's been punished enough, and that he's not a threat to us any longer. He even offers to be an ally, but for some reason you are not okay with it. You insist he should be punished some more. Can you taste the hypocrisy in the air? I sure can. Bucky, this is different, Steve said. No, it's not different. What would it be? The only reason I didn't get a bullet put in my head is because I'm your friend. That's why I was spared. The only reason I was spared. Because you didn't want me to die. But with Loki, you just say no. Screw Stark, screw whatever hell he's been through with the guy. Screw that he's the love of his life or whatever. Because he's just... Why are his reasons for wanting to help someone not good enough for you? Or only you're allowed to decide who gets to be spared. If you vouched for Loki, then it would be fine, but it's Stark, so you can't let him get away with it. Bucky looked really, really fed up and irritated. He always started clenching the metal fingers on his left arm when it got like this. He looked at Steve for a moment, then stood up. Where are you going? Steve asked. He hated it when Bucky stormed off angrily. I'm gonna grab the beer I left on your floor, and by the time I come back, I want you to stop being stupid. He left without another word, and Steve sat there for a moment, just thinking about what Bucky said. I rarely agree with Barnes, Phil said, but he is right about this. Loki tried to kill you, Clint said darkly. So did almost half the S.H.I.E.L.D. agents I've ever worked with, Phil replied easily, including Natasha. Loki was simply the closest to actually succeed. Steve had no idea how Phil could be so calm about such things. We tend to recruit from unusual places, Phil added. So you're fine with whatever he plans? Steve asked. Loki's dealings with Asgard or Jotunheim are not any of our concern, Phil said. He was also not the one who orchestrated the attack on Earth. Preparing and dealing with the threat of the real perpetrators takes precedence. Unless Loki proves to be a danger to Earth and humans again, we should spend our time with more important matters than him. It's all about priorities. I don't think I like this, Clint said. You made the first step to recognize Loki as a valuable asset, Phil pointed out. That is exactly how he should be treated. He can also provide incredibly valuable information about a lot of things. That's also not something to be ignored. Steve thought about it for a moment or two, but he couldn't think of any counter-argument besides the fact that it was Loki they were talking about, which was not really an argument at all. Jarvis, what is Thor doing? He asked instead. He's on his personal floor with Master Loki, Jarvis replied. I really don't like this teleportation thing, Steve groaned. Jarvis, you need to alert us whenever Loki is in the tower. I will certainly attempt to do so, Captain Rogers, but I must inform you that Master Loki has full security clearance to all Stark Industries properties, so he can override this instruction. He has the same clearance level as Stark? Clint asked. A very similar one, Jarvis said. This is nuts, Clint said. But not at all surprising, Phil said as he stood up. I have an appointment to get to, but do not forget. Priorities. He nodded at them both, then left. I hate it when Coulson makes sense, Clint said after a few moments of silence. You just can't argue with him. Steve sighed. We need to come to an agreement with Tony, he said then. We need to be very clear about the conditions of Loki's stay on Earth, and what we will do in case he breaks any of our terms. And Thor has made sure that Loki's put to trial. Whether it's in Asgard or not, doesn't matter. Like what terms and conditions? You want a contract? Gwen asked. No, I just want to make sure everyone's on the same page. Loki's out of our hands, but that doesn't mean we don't have any control over the situation. You gotta admit that we're between a rock and a hard place, Cap, Clint said. We want nothing to do with S.H.I.E.L.D., but if Stark Industries pulls out of financing us, the Avengers are totally done. Janet can't finance us alone. Pepper wouldn't do that, Steve said. Pepper's not the big boss anymore, Clint said. It's Stark, so I don't know how much control we actually have. This is giving me a headache, Steve admitted. Told you they were scary smart about this, Clint said. So we just sit and hope that Loki won't turn against us? I don't like our odds. It's not that, Clint asked. It's whether we trust Stark or not. He's forcing us to trust him, I guess, but it still comes down to that. How long did it take you to trust Natasha? Steve asked. It was Clint's turn to sigh. There are days when I'm still waiting for the other shoe to drop, Clint answered honestly. But it never stopped me from putting my life in her hands. But hey, I've been called stupid many times before. You could work with someone even when there's a chance they'll betray you. This is not a perfect world, Cap. You can't always have the best of the best to fight on your side. Sometimes you have to settle for the damaged, the broken, and the lesser evil. You get what you get and try to make the most of it. Do you want to trust Stark? Steve asked. I trust you to make the right decision about this, Clint said, and I'll follow your lead. The only problem with that was that Steve himself did not know what the right decision was. There was a time when he gave his trust easily, but those times were over. He learned it from working with S.H.I.E.L.D., from what happened with Bucky and Phil, from all the politicians who wanted to use him to get people to vote for them. Trust was not something he gave easily anymore. The weight of the trust of others was a familiar one, but even that felt heavier than it used to. Trust him to be a good man, Steve said absently. That was the real question. Years ago, when he watched him fly through that portal, he would have answered without a doubt that Tony Stark was a good man. Could he still say that? Pepper and Rhodey still stood by his side. That had to count for something. Steve had to wait for that moment of clarity, that sign that showed him that he was, that Tony was still a good man that could be trusted. Steve was certain that there would come a time when it would become clear, when Tony would either prove that he was still the man Steve wanted to believe him to be, or show his true colors. That moment would come when Tony would have to make a decision. Steve would know then. He would be sure then. Maybe I'm a little stupid too sometimes, he said then, but I guess we'll see whether the other shoe will drop or not. Clint looked at him for a moment, then nodded. You got it, Cap. They only had to wait and see and be prepared for both possibilities.